There is a lot of talk in cycling about why it's good to have a big aerobic engine, a high FTP. And it's true, it allows you to go fast for long periods of time, or crush epic alpine climbs, or simply dominate time trials. It's also rightly or wrongly become, in and of itself, a bit of a benchmark for performance. But actually, very often, almost always in fact, the best bits of cycling come not from having a big aerobic engine, but instead from being a human turbo. You want to win a race? You're gonna need a turbo. You want to get a K or a QOM? You're gonna need a turbo. You want to crush your mates on the weekly fast group ride? You are going to need a turbo. I'm not talking about sprinting here, but just down from that, anything from 30 seconds to 4 minutes of eye-poppingly hard riding. That is your turbo, typically called anything from anaerobic capacity or VO2 max, or simply the red zone. That's what people are talking about when they talk about going into the red. What is it though? Well, glad you asked. It's a short duration maximal exercise where instead of energy being produced by aerobic glycolysis, the majority is produced by hydrolysis of adenosine triphosphate and some via anaerobic glycolysis. In simpler terms, when you ride super hard for short periods of time, you use different energy systems and recruit additional types of muscle fibers compared to when you're riding at a steady lower intensity. Now, these types of muscle fibers are commonly called fast twitch fibers because they contract at a faster rate and also can produce more power. But they tend to do that without using oxygen, so they fatigue more quickly and are less efficient, which is why it's called your turbo, because you can't use it for long periods of time. It's for short bursts only. I find it helpful to think of anaerobic capacity a bit like a battery. The more power you need from it, the faster it will drain. And just like a battery, before you can use it again, you'll need to wait for it to recharge. Interestingly, again, just like a real-life battery, your anaerobic capacity will recharge faster from empty, but the closer to full that it gets, the slower that charge becomes. Through training, you can look to increase the power that you can sustain for a given time, so perfect for hoovering up those K or QOMs, but also the repeatability, so being able to do more of those efforts with less recovery between them, which is perfect for winning races and also destroying your mates on the group ride. The important thing to note here is that if you don't train at high intensities, then you won't stimulate those muscle fibers, and so you will lose your turbo. You might well be familiar with that feeling of being like a diesel engine. You've done loads and loads of steady riding, and then that one time where you do have to really kick on, press on the pedals and go into the red, and you have killed your legs for the rest of the ride. Just one anaerobic effort, and that's the nail in the coffin. So how do you improve? Well, as with any training, there are no magic sessions, I'm afraid, but the following tips will help you get the most out of yourself. I think it's really important to do your anaerobic capacity training when you're fresh. So to get the absolute most out of those sessions, you want to be able to dig really, really deep. And you can only do that if you're well rested going into it. Plus, because these sessions are so demanding, if you do try and do them when you're tired, it can actually be quite damaging, just sort of dragging your body through it. It is a really good idea to wear a heart rate monitor. Now, the reason being, if your heart rate doesn't go as high as you would expect, either in your warm-up or on your first interval of the day, it is a surefire sign that you are not well enough recovered and you should just sack off that session, try again another day. The exception to this is if you're looking to produce these anaerobic efforts when you're already tired, so perhaps at the end of a long ride, or more likely at the end of a long race. If that's the case, you'll want to do some of your training in a state of fatigue. And I know for a fact that some pro cycling teams look at this as actually some kind of performance metric. They'll test a rider doing a 3-minute max effort at the beginning of a ride, and then again after 4 to 5 hours, and they'll look at how much they've decreased in performance. As I said, anaerobic capacity training can be really demanding. And so if you do too much, you can quite easily overcook it, as illustrated by this handy graph of form relative to time. Now, every time you train, you kind of get a little bit worse. And then as you recover, you super compensate to end up in a better position than when you started. But because anaerobic capacity training is so demanding, you need to factor in more time to recover, because if you don't, you'll very quickly end up on a one-way ticket to chronic fatiguesville. Worst case scenario. There is, however, another alternative scenario, which is that actually you make gains really rapidly, but then you can quite quickly find that no matter how many VO2 max sessions you do, you're stuck on a plateau. So what I would recommend is maybe looking at doing a couple of sessions per week in the few weeks preceding that period of time where you want to theoretically be at your peak. And then the rest of the time you could do one session a week for maintenance, and then perhaps also consider some periods of time where you don't do any sessions a week to allow yourself to concentrate on building other areas, like perhaps your zone 2 or maybe even your zone 4. Training at other intensities is still beneficial for your anaerobic capacity work anyway. Your body always uses a mixture of energy systems when you ride. And when you're doing full gas efforts, those slow twitch fibers don't just switch off. They're still there producing energy aerobically, and actually they can also use lactate as a fuel as well. So, zone 2 riding? Yep, beneficial for anaerobic capacity as well. So what training should you do? Well, a little bit depends on what you specifically want to focus on, but a good place to start is with 30-second max intervals with 5 minutes recovery in between. Now, you know you're doing them right if you're really struggling to sustain the effort for the last 3 to 5 seconds. It's basically a really long sprint, and you'll find that 6 to maybe 10 in a session is more than enough. Personally, I find after 8, I feel a little bit sick. 3-minute efforts are also a really useful duration to train, certainly for race situations. Think of where races are won and lost, and often it'll be short climbs or attacking and following moves. To improve the amount of power you can produce for 3 minutes, give yourself ample recovery between your intervals. But to improve your resistance to fatigue, keep the recovery period shorter. A different approach focuses instead on trying to accumulate as much time as possible at your VO2 max intensity. So that's like the maximum amount of power you can sustain for 5 minutes in a single session. So I read about one called reverse ladders on the ever excellent Sweat Science column. And basically the theory goes that you do your longer intervals at the beginning of a session and then do progressively shorter intervals, but also with shorter recovery in between them. So you might start with a 4-minute interval with 3 minutes of recovery, and you end up doing 30 seconds on, 20 seconds off. Now, actual science has shown that people who do this type of session can spend twice as long at VO2 max intensity in a single workout compared to those that were doing either short or longer intervals. Which is weird, isn't it? But very cool. It comes back basically to what we were talking about earlier, with the emptier your turbo battery is, the faster it recharges. Should you do these training sessions indoors or outdoors? Perfectly valid question. I think as a rule, the simpler sessions should be done outdoors where possible, because most of us, almost all of us, produce higher powers when we're outside compared to riding indoors. And to get the biggest bang for your buck from these sessions, you want to be able to produce as much power as humanly possible. So think your 30-second sprints or your basic hill reps. However, it's perfectly possible to create really complex sessions that give you a comparable, perhaps even more potent training stimulus. And for these, it's definitely preferable to do them indoors, where you don't need to worry about roads or terrain or traffic. So think reverse ladders, for example, being a prime example of something that would definitely be better off done indoors. Lastly, as with any kind of training, make sure you're keeping a track of your performance and your improvements. Now, it's important to note that while this kind of training will pay dividends over longer durations as well, your typical 20-minute fitness test is not the best way of keeping track of any kind of improvements. Instead, I'd suggest, if you've got a power meter, using a power curve. So most training software has that built in. Training Peaks, Strava has one. And what it does is it allows you to see where you're making improvements and when. So if you're doing a 30-second max training session, you can see whether you've improved compared to last time. Equally, if you're doing 3-minute maxes, you can see where you're improving. Don't forget as well that fresh/fatigued test. So doing a 3-minute test at the beginning of a hard ride and 3 minutes at the end, particularly useful when you're racing. Now, that is, in a nutshell, anaerobic capacity, why you should train it and how you should train it. Let me know in the comments section what you think. Is it something you already do? Is it something that you're going to start doing? Get involved. I can't wait to read your comments. Give the video a big thumbs up if you've enjoyed it. I'll see you on the next one.